A lot of background noise from somebody.
I'm gonna mute a couple people here. Okay.
Okay, we're on the air. Welcome, everyone. I call the July 8, 2020 Planning Commission meeting to order. The gavel. The main purpose of tonight's meeting is a study session for the Commission on the draft elements of the Canyon Park Subarea Plan Update and also a public hearing on the plan update. Before we move on to the agenda items, I'd like to acknowledge our remote meeting format. We were assuming Proclamation 2028 regarding open public meetings expired midnight July 7th. There's some question about that. But we are holding this meeting under the Phase 2 guidelines for the Safe Start Plan, meaning up to 5 people, including the commission chair and staff, will be allowed to attend in person at any one time. The commissioners are participating remotely via WebEx. Public comment will be allowed both in writing and orally. The imagined Bothell notice, city website, and tonight's agenda all provided information to the public for providing comments. People wishing to comment today were instructed to notify staff or provide written comments by 3 p.m. today. The video of this meeting will be streamed live as well as recorded and available for later viewing on the city's YouTube channel. A call-in number was provided on the meeting agenda for members of the public who wish to call in by phone and listen live to the meeting. For our phone-in callers, during staff presentations, staff will make every effort to specify which meetings they are referencing so that everyone can follow along. Those who provided notice in advance will be able to make comments under the audience comment portion of the meeting, and we do have one live commenter. Email was encouraged as well and will be acknowledged, and we have a few to acknowledge there. As far as commissioners, Commissioner Pystrup is absent and excused from tonight's meeting. All the other commissioners are participating remotely. I can see from our little squares on the screen. In addition, the following city staff are in attendance: Community Development Director Mike Cotterman, present here, and Senior Planner Bruce Blackburn, remotely participating. And there are some consultants who will introduce as they come along. Lastly, before we begin, I'd like to reiterate some meeting guidelines for all meeting attendees. Please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking. And if you are also streaming the live video feed, please turn the sound off as there is a delay. It can be a little confusing. For the commissioners, at specific breaks in the presentation, I will call on members who wish to speak or ask a question. If you want to speak, please indicate by holding up your yellow speaker cards or otherwise get my attention, and we'll try and recognize everyone. It'll avoid the problem of 2 people speaking at the same time. Identify yourself before you ask a question, make a motion or second a motion, or participate in the debate. And please mute your microphone when not speaking. The first item on the agenda tonight is public comment. The city has accepted visitor comment in writing as well as accepted sign-up sheets for those who wish to speak at tonight's meeting. Written comments submitted to staff no longer than 3 p.m. were forwarded to all commissioners and are part of the record. And I'll let Director Cotterman speak to the comments we've received thus far.
No comments were received by me today, Mr. Chair. Bruce, I don't know if you received any by 3 o'clock. Okay, we do have some that were submitted last week, and we'll note those when we get to the public hearing.
Okay, so nothing new. If there are any call-ins or attendees wishing to comment in person, Director Cotterman will call on them one at a time for comments up to 3 minutes.
And I see we do have one caller. I don't know if that's someone who wanted to speak, so I've unmuted you. If you would like to speak, please state your name. Can you hear me? Would anyone like to speak? I presume, Mr. Chair, that this individual is not here to speak this evening, okay. Or maybe they're here for the public hearing, and we'll call on them again at that time.
Okay, then shall we proceed to public comment? We have a Would you like to recognize him now or during the hearing?
During the hearing.
During the hearing, okay. There are no minutes prepared for approval for tonight's meeting, so we will move on to the public hearing. I open the public hearing on the Canyon Park Subarea Plan Update. Senior Planner Bruce Blackburn will lead the hearing. And at the conclusion of the hearing, I will note any comments received and ask for a motion to continue the hearing to the July 15th meeting. Bruce? Oh, you're muted. Still can't hear you.
I think somebody muted me. This is, of course, a public hearing on the Canyon Park sub-area plan. And essentially what we've got here is that we have somewhat of an interesting situation where we're going to have a public hearing this evening. We're going to have one next week as well as August 5th. This will be the first public hearing we have. My understanding is that there is somebody in the audience who would like to speak. You have in the record 8 exhibits, which we have previously provided to the commission. I don't think I'll read every single one of those exhibits into it because my computer has just flashed off on me, unfortunately. But the concept there is that all those will be part of the record. We are going to post those as well as the sub-area plan and other information on our webpage so that they can be viewed by other people. So I think at this time I would turn it over to the chair to accept public testimony that we have for this evening.
All right, thank you, Bruce. Mute, unmute. I do see that we have one member of the public who would like to speak to the plan. So I'd like to recognize you and ask you to speak in whatever manner works with the technology we have right now.
If you could keep a little distance and speak loudly, you don't need to touch anything.
Roger Bolanich. I was the developer of Canyon Park Business Center, and I've always had a target of biotech and life sciences. So I heartily support the designation of life sciences at Canyon Park. And segue to that, I also support office residential H on the interchange properties that I've submitted in both letters of February 28th and July 1, which are of record. I think that will allow all technical things to be fulfilled at Canyon Park. And the march is on from Bellevue to Bothell and from Seattle to Bothell, I assure you. And I've been working here since 1978 on the shopping centers. I support the mitigation area on 228. I also submit a Snohomish County Conservation District, which coincidentally just identified this same area for a mitigation area. So that's very supportive and very significant to provide a mitigation area. I happen to own that property. I also support the park designation on 31st that's been identified in the report, in your report, and at least to get it on the designated. Whether it happens or not remains to be seen. I'm willing, as I've said to the record, donate that 17 acres. But leaving that aside, I think it's significant to have it on your plan. I might say on life sciences, and you'll tap me on the shoulder if I proceed too long.
Got a minute and a half.
Oh, okay. I started off with ATL, which became Phillips in 1983, while I was still working on the plan and adopting the plan in Snohomish County. I've always targeted, as I said before, biotech, Immunex, U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Genentech, who became the successor to. So I really think that we have a very strong matter going here that I've been following for all these years. And I hope those matters that you will endorse. Okay, thank you very much. If there should be any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
I'll make sure I scan that and get it to everybody.
Oh, what's that?
I'll make sure I scan that
Oh.
and send it to everybody.
Oh, yes, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blanich. Am I on? Yes, I'm on. Thank you for your comments. Director Cotterman will enter your materials in the record, and as he indicated, scan them and get them to the other commissioners for our review. And we will be hearing this at least 2 more times before recommendations are made.
I still have been around for 42 years.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And then, Mr. Chair, I'll check with that's Bothell Virtual Host 5 and see if they wanted to speak as well. That's the only other one that we have that I'm aware of that may be wanting to speak. So at this time, this is the public hearing for Canyon Park. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that. The individual that's on the line.
Looks like they unmuted.
And not muted. Could you acknowledge whether you wish to speak?
They just muted again.
Okay, I guess.
Sorry, this is Steve Morikawa. So I'm just,
Oh,
somebody
okay, Steve.
unmuted me. I'm just listening in.
All right, I didn't know if that was, I didn't know who it was, Steve. I thought it might be someone that wanted to testify during the public hearing. Did you want to say something profound to the group?
Nope, not unless asked. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Steve. Then I believe that's all we have, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so seeing no further public comments, we will end. I'd like to ask for a motion from one of the commissioners to continue the hearing to the July 15th meeting so we may receive any additional comments as others desire. So is there a motion to continue? Commissioner Olson, you're muted.
I move to continue the public hearing to July 15th.
Okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Olson. I see Commissioner Curd double signaling. Commissioner Curd, unmute, and we can.
I'd like to second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Olson, a second from Commissioner Curd. All in favor of continuing the public hearing until July 15th, please indicate by raising your hand. And I think we have unanimous approval to continue, so we will continue the hearing, reopening it at the July 15th meeting. So with that, we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the study session. And the Canyon Park study session includes 2 policy questions tonight. We'll pause Bruce's presentation for discussion after each and allow time for questions and comments. And at the conclusion, commissioners will have an opportunity to identify other questions or seek additional information as time allows. So Bruce, you want to take it away?
Thank you very much again, Chair. This is, of course, a study session to talk about some of the items we didn't necessarily get to last week. And we have a special treat for you because we have invited Bob Bengdorf, a principal of Makers, to come and give you kind of a little bit of a preview of what the implementing regulations could look at. We haven't really had a chance to even talk about that. We thought this might be a good opportunity just to introduce the commission to these concepts. So next slide, please. And that gets us to the part 2 study session, which is basically the review of those last conceptual early draft items. Next slide, please. And talk a little bit about sub-area plan number 3. And that's about the urban design and community livability. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn over to Rachel Miller, who I think I saw her earlier, and she's going to continue to lead the discussion on these items, I think.
Yes, indeed, I will. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks again, commissioners, for having us here. Glad to be here with Bob Bankford. He'll be giving a lot more detail on some of the things I'll be overviewing today. As you know, we've been going through chapter by chapter through the sub-area plan, trying to highlight the major concepts for you all. So one of the things that we didn't get to last time was the urban design section, urban design and community livability. So the purpose of this chapter and the strategies in it are really to highlight how this can become a holistic set of neighborhoods, how it can be around the clock, vibrant, people really enjoying living and working here, getting around in safe, walkable ways, bikeable, scooterable, however, and supporting the businesses and residences that might be here. So places for informal and creative interaction. We just heard the support for the Life Sciences Hub, and what we've heard from those folks is the idea of innovation and being able to meet up informally and casually and spark the next creative idea. And then better connections to the amenities and assets that are already here. So the natural amenities in particular of North Creek and the wetlands, as well as the trail associated with North Creek. And as I mentioned, the walkability, bikeability, and all of that. Next slide, please. So some of the strategies are to really focus on these new neighborhoods. Some of them are already evolving, and there's a great groundwork in place. Thrasher's Corner and Canyon Park Place, namely. There's already a set of retail that's really serving the region well and residents that do live nearby. But evolving those areas into neighborhood centers. So these three pink areas are what we're calling the neighborhood centers. And a big piece of that are the streets that really become like a main street, kind of like a mix between a traditional main street and something that works better for Canyon Park and the uses that we expect to see here. Public gathering spaces is a big part of that. We've heard that throughout this process, is that folks are really interested in signature gathering places of some sort. And again, supported by that Life Sciences Innovation Hub idea where people are able to gather in public places outdoors, combined with the private places that help activate them. And multifaceted neighborhood centers. So these are good for living, working, playing. Your kids can get watched there. All the pieces that make a neighborhood work for everybody. We expect to see evolve slowly over time here. Next slide, please. Can we get the next slide? Okay. So giving a little bit of an overview, and again, Bob's going to get into more detail on this, the neighborhood centers streets idea, and on that last slide, it was those yellow ones, and I think you all have seen there's a block frontage street map or block street front map in the sub-area plan that highlights major areas of focus. And so we're calling them primary neighborhood center streets and secondary neighborhood center streets. And then there's a whole host of 3-block connections that'll be the other streets as well. And common to all of them are that these areas of focus, the neighborhood center streets, we would like to see entries on regular intervals or tightly spaced entries, and flexible ground floor layout and design, and we'll talk more about that later. Perhaps maximum store size and or average area or depth. And those ideas are really to make sure that and transparency is another one I should have put on there. So those ideas are just to make sure that it feels active when you're walking along one of these streets. The primary streets would likely have commercial ground floors, so residential uses probably wouldn't be appropriate in these very select places. And surface parking is one of the big things that we would want to limit in the primary neighborhood center streets. The secondary ones would be more flexible. Residential could be allowed, and maybe surface parking, but probably limited to the side or back or under the building. Next slide, please. So we did mention last week as well that we might call these storefront streets or main streets, but we want you all to know that we're really open to what this is. And I think we heard last week from you all that this is a supported idea, that light industrial, flex tech, spaces that you might not think of traditionally on a set of storefronts could still be okay here. So we want to make sure that that's still an appropriate thing and how adaptive or how flexible we could be in that regard. Next slide, please. Something else that we are considering and is especially useful at this point with all of the social distancing that needs to be going on is provisions for outdoor space and making sure that that's accommodated or asked for. Next slide, please. And then also that in some manner, and again, Bob's going to get more into this, that somehow there are these public gathering spaces, those green stars located some major areas, and they're just conceptual locations, but that when redevelopment comes in, they're somehow contributing to some major spaces, and that they're well integrated into the neighborhood around them. Next slide, please. And this is an example from the Google campus in Kirkland. And so this is just showing probably a bigger thing than what we might expect here, but an idea that not only is it a residential serving thing, but it could also be a business serving type of public amenity. Next slide, please. And Bob will again get into more of this, but just showing an example, there's a whole range. So the ones I showed that are the aerial views were more like public, really public, bigger spaces, but you could have a host of small spaces that are publicly accessible or even cut off and provided just to residents. But getting a mix of these open space types is something that we'll be trying to get through the design guidelines. So our big question for you today is, what are your thoughts on the primary and secondary neighborhood center streets? Are we hitting the overview right, that they should be pretty flexible, that we do want windows and entries pretty frequently, but that's about all we want to regulate, and that otherwise they'll be pretty flexible. They could be light industrial, there could be garage doors, there's a whole range of non-traditional storefronts that we could allow here. I think that's how I interpret that question, Bruce, but please jump in.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And that's exactly what we want to add, as much flexibility to respond to modern situations. And I think that the last 3 months has shown us that there is a new approach that we need to think about for these type of spaces onto our street areas. So I will turn it back over to Rachel at this point. Thank you.
Are we stopping for discussion there?
Yes, let's
I think so.
pause and see whether any of the commissioners have questions, comments, additional information. I'll recognize Commissioner Curd first, and then Commissioner Bleak.
Thanks. This is Commissioner Curd. Thanks, Rachel, for the presentation so far. It's very visually exciting. There's a lot going on. I have a quick question about these neighborhood center streets. I'm wondering if by adding flexibility, we're also discussing what setbacks might look like. I know on the main streets that we love in downtown areas across the state, but also in Bothell, we are able to get these storefronts so close together because of the lack of a setback, side setbacks. Is that something that would be discussed in this kind of base code?
Yeah, you know what, I might just let us push that off until Bob is talking in more detail, or even another one when we come back and talk in more detail about design guidelines and regulations. But your interest is that there's the right setback, right, from the curb to the store, to the building front, that is not too wide, not too close. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's important, but I'm also kind of wondering about side setbacks from between businesses.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Okay, so the idea of like zero lot line kinds of things. Okay, yes, I will take that note. I don't think the sub-area plan makes any specific statement about that at this point, but that's a good point.
I think that would add in some flexibility too, if we're trying to kind of develop these neighborhood gathering spaces and center streets that have a lot going on and a lot packed into a small area. Could just add some more flexibility. Thanks.
Yeah.
So Commissioner Bleak and then Commissioner Alderks.
Thank you, and thank you for that presentation, Rachel and Bruce. I guess in reviewing the packet and looking at the questions for today, I feel like I while I am interested in allowing a lot of flexibility for architects to be able to design the way they do for the future, I don't know if there was a question in there with regards to kind of facades that look like doors. I think I kind of like the idea of requiring a door every certain number of feet, kind of similar to what we currently have in the code. Just because you have a door there, you can, I guess an architect or somebody could make that into a closet, or it could be a stairwell, or it could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be the front of the building, but I kind of like that, along as well as windows on the first floor. Not necessarily windows that go all the way to the ground, but just to have some kind of design standards there. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds about that, but that's where I am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Aldrichs.
This is Commissioner Jenny Aldrich. Thank you, Rachel. That was like really being able to see kind of an example of what you're describing was very helpful. One of the questions that the question that came up for me was related to those pass-throughs. So I didn't see it mentioned in your presentation, but the idea that you could cut through buildings so you don't have block-sized or multi-block long buildings, is that also included in what you're describing here tonight?
Yes, and I didn't get into the through block connection idea very much because Bob is going to cover it. And we, as you might remember, last week we talked a little bit about the intervals between those connections. And so we did get the direction that flexibility in how big those blocks are, they can be bigger east of North Creek, essentially, in the more employment-oriented areas, and west of North Creek, smaller, more walkable areas where those cut-throughs happen more frequently. So yes, Bob will get more into detail on what those are and what the different types of those actually can even become.
If I could ask for clarification, Commissioner Aldrichs, I'm not sure if are you asking about walkways through buildings or between buildings that would go through a block?
Rachel might know the answer to that better than me based on what she described. I think the option is both, correct? It could be either or.
Well, yes, and what might have started this discussion is that image of a South Lake Union building that it looks like it's a walkway through a building because the building is designed in such a way. I think it might even have an overhead pass through, but it actually would, in effect, work as a passageway through, even publicly accessible. So you're right, there's some overlap. I think there could also be crossover in the open space that businesses could be required to provide. And these through block connections. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
But, yeah, I think, and the reason I asked for the clarification, and one of you jump in if I'm mischaracterizing this, I think our focus was primarily on providing through block connections that would be open between buildings. That wouldn't preclude the possibility of it going through a building, but I don't think we had looked at necessarily not requiring that, but maybe allowing for it if they wanted to do that in lieu of providing that. So I just wanted to clarify that to make sure that we were on the same page with the comment.
Thanks for clarifying that. And was there being internal through block connections that would be not outdoors and off when the buildings are closed?
You broke up a little bit while you were speaking. Could you repeat that, please?
I was trying to understand Michael's clarification even further and to see if there was interest in those internal connections being private, or if we're all still just talking about public connections that are outdoors.
Any comments from a commissioner about that? Seeing pensive faces, but no one to comment.
So I'd suggest at this point that we continue on the path that we've been on, which is they're really more intended to be open areas. But certainly we wouldn't preclude the possibility if someone comes in with a building design and they want to allow that. I don't think we'd be opposed to that. Is that a fair direction to go? I'm seeing a few
See
nods.
some nodding heads. Yeah.
Okay. Rachel's nod doesn't count. I'm not looking at her.
Oh,
Okay. Thank
So-
you.
so I
I
have
don't
a
want to spend too much
question.
time on that. I just wanted to get some clarity around it.
I just want to ask a quick question about how the thought of the zero clearance between buildings meshes with the connections.
Yeah, and I think, did you say Bob would talk about that a little bit more?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll hold
Yeah.
that.
And I think the idea is that we actually have really large parcels, so it's kind of a funny thing. I'm not sure where it would even play out, but essentially for your 200-foot block or whatever you have, you would have cheek to jowl buildings side by side with all of the entries and storefronts side by side for that block. But then you'd have your through block connection and then your next block.
All right, shall we move to the next item then? Bruce, do you lead us there?
yes.
Mr. Gustafson, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Sarah Gustafson here. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Rachel. I think I saw some photos from Olympia, so I'm not sure if that was the case.
Yes, indeed. Yes. There was a makerspace from there.
Great. Yeah, wonderful. I did have some questions for you or Bob about the crime prevention through environmental design. I'm not sure if you could share some examples of how that might work in this setting.
Yeah. So those are a set of design guidelines that are placed around public spaces. So they can be for streets or for open space or public gathering spaces is where they typically play out. And the biggest idea behind them is passive surveillance so that you have enough people nearby watching over the space. So people either on above ground floors or having some kind of active area on the ground floor adjacent to any public space that you want people to be attracted to and feel safe in. So it's mostly about visibility and having people around. So what I mean by visibility is not designing something that obstructs views where you want to be able to see across a space and see if somebody's walking towards you or things that are happening on the other side of the park. And Bob is welcome to add on.
Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought I was muted. Bob Bankford here. Good evening, commissioners. Yeah, I'll probably reserve this for talking when I get into the block frontage discussion because we touch upon it there and also in open space, which I'll talk about because we largely integrate the SEPTED principles into the design standards for these other components.
Okay. So shall we move then to the...
Back to the
Anyone else?
presentation. Yes.
Okay.
And slide 2 again.
So Bob, this is you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. Bear with me. It's my first post-COVID planning commission meeting. So, but anyways, it's been great to jump back into Canyon Park and help Bruce, Dave, and Rachel and all of you with the regulations. So I've been looking at where the concept and the goals and policies and vision are. And largely what we're looking at is a complete replacement of Chapter 1248, which is the Canyon Park Subarea regulations. If we go to the next slide. And this is kind of a table of contents of our concept for what will go in 1248. And so we'll address the purpose and applicability. We'll obviously have a new use chart and density and dimensional standards that will touch on all those setback issues that were brought up. We'll also have some provisions addressing the street design within the right-of-way and also the sidewalks, even when they're out of the right-of-way. And I'll also deal with those through block connection designs, and I'll get into that shortly. And also include the off-street parking standards. And then Article 4 will deal with the block frontages, which I'll introduce tonight. And then Article 5 will deal with the other site planning issues, which include the open space, on-site outdoor space, which I'll talk about, but this will be the last thing I talk about. And then building design will be the other component here. Next slide. So I did want to mention the approach. So the approach that we take with these types of zoning and design regulations is really try to get that good balance of predictability and flexibility. And so we do that by having clear minimum standards, but integrating strategic departure provisions. And so departures are not like a variance, but they're, we wouldn't allow them with every rule, but maybe certain ones. So maybe you allow about 20 to 25 departure provisions. And you can see there's an example of a criteria that talks about it for facade transparency, weather protection. So, but that's an approach that we've worked with, and it's worked really well because it allows the city to say no when the design isn't very good and it doesn't meet the intent, but it allows some flexibility and some good negotiation for staff in the city. Next slide. So this is kind of an agenda of the elements I'll talk about. So again, the block frontages, the through block connections, and the internal open space. So let's just go to the next slide. So block frontages. So the point of this is to really look at, okay, where do we want to have the storefronts, and where do we want to require them versus where we want to make them optional? And also, you know, where are the areas where you want to have maybe stoops or a modest landscape setback? And then there may be blocks like the highway frontage. Maybe you want to have a special design. It's a little bit different. Maybe you want to have a certain setback or something unique. So the map on the right is an example that we put together for Mount Lake Terrace's town center. Let's go to the next slide. So, and it's important to note that when we talk about these block frontages standards, we're talking about the development frontages. So from the back of the required sidewalk to kind of the front part of the development. So if it's a storefront, it deals with that facade design. If it's a setback, it deals with that, the design of the setback after the sidewalk, and then the building itself, because there's going to be other provisions that deal with the right of way and the sidewalk. Next slide. So why this approach? So again, we've used this probably on about 40 other projects in all types of communities. But what I like about it is it doesn't recognize that it recognizes that every street is different, and you know, you want to have different approach for some of these different types of streets. And then you can tailor them however you want to be as strict or as loose to try to get the desired built form that you want. And then the other thing is adaptable. If you see in 5 years or 10 years that you want to adjust it or change the designation, you could do that. And lastly, it's worked. So that's why we're recommending this approach. Next slide. So this is just an example summary of usually the 4 basics. So the main one is usually storefronts and saying, okay, they're required, and I'll get into the details in a minute. And then there's the one in the green, stoop landscape, where you require a minimum setback, whether it's 5 or 10 feet or more. And then secondary is kind of what we call a mixture, where you can do either. So it's the most flexible. And if you want to do a storefront, you can do a storefront, but you have to meet the storefront standards. And then undesignated at the bottom is just those other streets where you want to allow more flexibility. So I'll get into some details in a minute. Go to the next slide. So like, here's an example of storefronts with, again, it shows an example of some window transparency requirements. It shows a height example. Like, I think downtown has a 14-foot minimum floor to ceiling, or maybe it's 15. So we'd probably want to match that, I would suggest, so to update the graphic. Minimum weather protection, you know, we've used anywhere from 5 or 6 feet minimum, or minimum average depth. obviously you want the entries facing the street. And then we've also done, it was mentioned about having doors or entries. We've done things like requiring a door or an entry every 40 or 60 feet. So that's something that can be added. Let's go to the next slide. This is just an example of the charts we typically use in the actual zone regulations, where we get into the details about the ground floor use, retail space depth is something we deal with, and then showing examples. And also you see some funny symbols there. They indicate areas where you could depart potentially. Next slide. And then there's the other one, for the lack of a better name, we're calling for now stoop/landscape frontage. So this is kind of more of the where you get redevelopment and you want that pedestrian friendly design that maybe has a modest landscape setback, whether it's a stoop or something a little more significant. And so the typical standards would have some, include some weather protection just over the entry, and then maybe have some scaled down transparency. So you're integrating some of those SEPTED principles and have some visibility between the buildings and the street. And then of course you have the entry facing the street. And then there's some examples to the right. Next slide. And then again, secondary is you can do either or. So if you do a storefront, you just got to meet the storefront design standards, or if you have a landscape setback, you meet the stoop landscape standards. Next slide. And then again, undesignated, more flexible. And again, no restrictions on parking other than whatever your landscape buffer setbacks are. And like this type of thing would be where on some of the outer employment low zones, where you have these buildings that are probably not going to be redeveloped for a long time, and you already have these parking lots in front. And so you probably just, my suggestion would be to look at it just not designated and making those frontages flexible. Next slide. So we don't have a detailed map yet. That's something that we're working on. But I do want to say that for your primary / storefronts, those are going to be your most strict requirements. And what I always suggest is really limiting that to just those critical core block fronts where you feel you have to have that ground floor non-residential use or whatever active uses you define for it to meet the requirements, and assume that you're going to have some secondary where there's choices of storefronts that bleed out from there. But you don't want to go too far, because then you may discourage development or end up with a lot of vacant spaces that you can't use. Next slide. So actually, maybe we could pause there if there's any comments on those elements before we get into through block connections.
So do any of the commissioners have questions or comments on the presentation thus far? Commissioner Bleet.
Yes, thank you, Bob, for that presentation so far. It's been awesome. Is there a way to go back to that slide where there was, oh, I can't remember. There was some with more brick facades and one with more plank siding on it. Do you know how hard it's to see?
Let's just scroll back and see where we end up.
Great. All right, let's see. A little bit further, right, maybe, shoot, no, I guess, sorry, the other direction. Sorry. Back towards the end. Yeah, maybe like right in those areas. I just wanted to comment that I guess later when we're talking about design standards, yeah, that's the one I want to see actually. There's the one on the left. I'm not sure what that tan material is. I guess what I hope or envision for the Canyon Park area is to have strong design standards, so we don't, I know right now it's pretty prevalent to have that kind of plank siding on the sides of new apartment buildings and such, and it just seems really boring to me and not very aesthetically pleasing. I feel like it's probably more affordable to put it up. But do you have any background with regards to how
Yes.
to set design standards with regards to visual appeal for the siding, like whether
Oh,
it's
yeah.
faux brick? Okay.
Yeah, I think you're talking about hardy panel and hardy plank, and I actually have it on my house. But I understand, and I've seen all your buildings downtown, and we put some good standards and options, or we will be able to present some good standards and options for you with lots of photo examples, because it is a very economical material, but there's some examples. I think it's like the one that faces the Anderson School has that big, large facade that's all hardy plank, and it's all the same colors. So sometimes we say to limit the amount that maybe you could use it, but you have to integrate it with other materials. And what I always encourage too is that you try to look at all of these standards holistically. So if you look at the building on the left here that has the text over it, that includes brick on the lower part, but then it's got ephes, which is like that stucco-like material. And so this is in Boise, but it's an effective example. Ephes wears probably better in Boise than it does here, but they did a good job of mixing in materials, for instance, and adding detailing. So I think, whether it's ephes or metal or hardy plank, I think you can use them effectively. It depends on how it's carried out. And so our standards, we dig into that pretty good. And so I think once we get there, we'll take a stab in showing you some options, and you can tell us to ramp up, ramp down, go sideways.
Okay.
I think you'll like it.
Very much. Thank you.
Okay, other commissioners. Commissioner Alders.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Alders here. I am wanting to understand how uniform are you hoping these buildings to look like? Or is there going to be a pretty diverse mix of what? So I guess what I'm asking is, are we going to have this be designed in a way that it has to be like old colonial style? Like, right, you're not going to assign a style. Okay, I appreciate that. So there's not going to be one set assigned style for everything.
No.
But so you are looking for a diversity between buildings side by side, or like a whole block's not going to look the same. That.
Well, we don't get into requiring that all buildings look completely different, but we allow for the whole variety, and it's usually I only suggest getting into character and limiting that if we're working with a Leavenworth or a Winthrop, or where you have a very distinct established thing that you want to keep. But I think in an area like this, you want to kind of break it open and let there be some innovation. So I would say, only if you use certain materials. Again, it's like usually it's concrete block, metal, ephes, and hardy panel. If you use certain materials, there's some conditions on how to use them while making them more human scale and interesting, and not boring, for the lack of a better word.
And if I could just add a little bit to that, I think part of that will depend on how large the development is. If it's a single developer that's doing an entire block, for example, they may come in with a design that applies to the entire block. So, and I think what I've heard from the commission as we've talked about this indirectly about some other things is that you probably want some variety in there. So I think that's one of the things that we would talk to the applicant about at that time. Again, as Mr. Bangford said, we're not going to require anything in particular as far as the design, but we're certainly going to work with them and try to get some variety in there. But again, it's going to depend on how big that individual project is. Most of the time, I think we're going to see portions of blocks being developed by a single developer as opposed to an entire block, since these are some fairly large blocks.
Good.
And following up on that, On the secondary avenues, we talked about there being a variance, either being storefront or landscape setback. Would that variance be building by building or block by block? Could you have a block that has both mixed in?
Yes, it's simply a developer choice. If they can do a mix, they can zigzag in and out. And they could also do versions that are almost a mixture of the two that maybe are a blend where you have, it's almost like a storefront, but it's got a small little setback. So there's flexibility to do sort of a hybrid.
Okay, thank you. Other commissioners, questions, comments? Okay, I'll ask one other question. Are we making any distinctions on corners versus mid-block? At other meetings, we did talk a little bit about corners having some requirements.
Yes, and actually we just took out a slide that we was going to talk about corners because I thought it might be too long. But what we would probably be looking at is identifying some like high visibility street corners where you'd want to have kind of articulated designs, whether it's kind of a cutout or a cropped corner or a kind of a turret on the building or just some more articulated design. We do that in a lot of projects, and I think the Subarea plan mentions some treatments on some of the main corners, but I'd recommend that.
Okay, thank you. Any other, or shall we move on? Okay, I guess we can move forward with the presentation.
Okay. Okay, let's move on to through block connections. Back up just a couple. Keep going. And we're going backwards now. There. All right. Thank you. So I think Rachel and Bruce have probably talked about this enough, but the concept map here, I think this will be good where you identify conceptual locations where the grid is largely set. So pretty much east of 527, you've identified some conceptual locations for mid-block connections within these larger super blocks. Although this version of the map shows some to the west, I think because that's a little more wide open and it may probably take a little bit longer for those to redevelop. But for those really larger super blocks, what you might do is take either a maximum block length or a maximum block perimeter standard, because I guess there's a lot more question as to what's going to happen on those sites and where the roads are going to be to begin with. For some of those, you could vary. For some of the more intensive zones, you obviously have shorter blocks than your employment low if you need to have that. Let's go to the next slide. So I think Rachel showed these last time, but this just shows an example in South Lake Union where you have the blocks are 400 feet long and 325 feet wide. Those are pretty typical urban blocks. And when you get this urban office or residential or mixed use development, they fit well into those sizes, and you're gonna need those connections to begin with. And so I think really these mid-block connections things are one of the more exciting components of your Subarea plan and really create an opportunity to do some cool things. Next slide. Next slide just shows Canyon Park and again, some of the width. So I think where you've shown your mid-block connections are good and they're workable from a development standpoint. Next slide. So as far as the design of the through block connection, the concept that I put together initially here looks at allowing some choices for how you design the actual connection. And so what I think is you could use like an alley design, or you can use a WUNERF, which is a shared pedestrian car low traffic speed design, or a landscape passageway, which is just pedestrian only, or what we call urban passageway, which is more narrow, active design, or a combination of those. So I'll go into the details on the next few slides. I think the next one gets into alley. So the traditional alley one, to me, you reserve that for the kind of the core where you're doing your storefronts, because everything's going to be jammed up next to each other. So you want to allow the traditional alley concept where it's whatever it is, 20, 22 feet wide. And so for an example, you could say that it's permitted on blocks where at least half of the frontages are storefronts. That's an example approach. Next slide. So the WUNRF would be something like this cross section here. We have a shared car pedestrian lane that's about 20 feet wide, meets your fire code. And you'd have some landscape strips on either side up to the building. So these, to me, you could do these anywhere. Any of the through block connections could have a design like this. And then later I'll get into the frontage standards for the buildings that front on these, but want to make sure those are integrated. So let's go to the next slide though. So the other version is pedestrian only. And so the cross section here shows an example. And this is just an example. You'd want at least 8 feet, maybe you want wider. But to the right are some examples. The one in the upper right's from Yesler Terrace, pretty neat new example that's stair steps, and the one lower right's in downtown Redmond, where they've long had these through block connections and they work pretty well. But again, we have a choice to figure out, should the landscaped area be 5 or 11 feet, or maybe we'll allow some flexibility. Next slide. And then maybe for the some of the core areas, or I'm stepping ahead of myself. So again, we want to have some frontage standards to see how the design of the connection is integrated with the design of the buildings that front on these connections. So we'd have some standards for if you have a WUNRF design or a landscape passageway, you'd have some standards that talk about the frontages on them, including in talking about parameters for setbacks, stoops, weather protection over entries, porches, some minimum transparency and integrating the SEPTED components. So you don't have a blank wall up against these that make them unsafe and undesirable. Next slide. And then urban passageways. So why not allow these? So, these, we can figure out what the minimum width is, but the minimums can be anywhere from 12 to 16 feet wide. If they're wider, they can allow for some outdoor seating, but you'd want to make sure that you have some active uses along there. So you may not need the full primary storefront standard that gets into more 70% transparency. So maybe 40%, something a little bit lower, but it's still active. So examples, well, 2 of them are from London, and the one in the middle is actually from South Lake Union, where it's open and that's actually the historic smokestack in the distance, but the building overhead goes over top. So that's where you might allow some flexibility for the building to go over top as long as it's open underneath. So next slide. So that kind of wraps up the initial concept for through block connections. Any comments on that?
Commissioners, questions or comments? Commissioner Alders and then Commissioner Curd.
Thank you, Chair. And kudos on that presentation. Mainly my comment is these are actually really exciting visuals to imagine, a very walkable space. I guess one comment I would also add to that is prioritizing greenery in these spaces as well, so landscaping, so that, just for air quality and helping it feel like it's a flexible kind of natural space, even though you're in a city. So I kind of tend towards more landscaping is great, especially, you know, for runners and things. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm, like, I heard you say that there's 4 different kind of options for the frontages. And, but I'm not saying like, I want landscaping all the time, everywhere. Prioritizing landscaping is good, not necessarily at the expense of others.
Commissioner Curd?
Thanks. This is Commissioner Curd. Thank you for the presentation so far. It's also exciting. Lots of stuff to think about and to see. It's very visual. One of the things that I'm wondering about is this Woonerf idea. It's been proposed downtown too, so we have a little bit of experience taking a look at these. I'm interested, especially because Bothell's fire code requires a 22-foot wide paved surface for fire access. That's just a really big piece of pavement. And so I'm wondering if maybe we could add in, maybe piggybacking off of the vegetation comments that Commissioner Aldrich was talking about, maybe adding in language or design elements that could help reduce speed further, just kind of passively. There's not a lot of wiggle room when it comes to designing new street areas that, I mean, the fire code can't really be budged, at least in the planning side of things. And so adding in more elements that will help slow drivers down and really allow that to be an actual shared use facility is pretty important. But it's exciting so far, so thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Vliet?
Yes, I want to, I guess, echo a little bit what Commissioner, this is Commissioner Vliet, what Commissioner Aldrich said, and then Commissioner Curd alluded to with regards to more greenery. I feel like a lot of places I go, there's just a lot of concrete that doesn't, to me, just kind of shout out sustainability, which I know is a big goal of the cities now. And I think having greeneries and bioswales is a way for this, what will be, I guess, heavily redeveloped area to be redeveloped correctly, where we're infiltrating a lot more of that water near to on-site rather than pushing it somewhere else. So thanks, Commissioner Aldrich, for pointing that out.
Any other questions, comments? I've got one, perhaps a level of detail more than we're at, but the scooters have returned to Bothell. Are we thinking about how to accommodate the scooters, whether it be through parking or getting them through these spaces? Is that a consideration?
Sure.
Yeah, we have policies in 2 places, I think, in the sub-area plan about it. Curb space, we just added a curb space and parking section in the transportation area, but then also in the urban design area, I think we have direction that there should be a certain amount of parking required with redevelopment, and that would be for bikes and scooters. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they bring a lot as far as circulation through the space.
Yeah.
There's also a little bit of controversy about where they end up. So, Commissioner Aldrich.
Thank you. Jenny Aldrich here. Thank you, Commissioner Vliet, for bringing up kind of the sustainability, because I have not heard any mention of LEED buildings or sustainable buildings. Are we targeting specifically that type of development? Is there room in the code for having some green buildings and some demonstration projects in that way in this area, especially since we're looking at it as a life science center? Any interest in that? I'm very curious to hear.
So in terms of stormwater, the new city stormwater manual requires a lot more than what this area mostly was redeveloped under already. So that on-site infiltration should happen as much as is possibly feasible because of the new stormwater manual. And then in terms of green buildings, we do have that as a recommendation in the sub-area plan. How that plays out in the regulations or incentives, I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot of things we are asking for in this area, adding to public space, adding bike share parking, affordable housing. So there's all kinds of really important, expensive things. And so that's something we'll have to balance and figure out what's required, what's an incentive, what do we say is a really good idea.
Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just at what point is that a conversation that we would be having here on the Planning Commission? Is that more of a regulatory thing later? Or, I don't know, you let me know.
Yeah, Bob, do you think that would be when we're figuring out incentives and actually I'll look to Bruce as well.
Yeah, I mean, now's the time that we'll be talking about it and figuring out, do you work it into your incentive system, or do you simply, I don't know if you want to just require a certain minimum. I mean, there's a lot of cities take different approaches to it. But I've just been working pretty quickly here on getting some initial concepts, but that's something we haven't tackled yet, but it's I'm glad you brought it up, and we will need to.
So the question I heard is, do we incorporate some requirement for environmental design, either LEED or one of the other green building certifications? Is that a fair summary?
And is that an incentive that you'd like us to see if we can work into the regulations to encourage that type of building, green building? Or are you looking at recommending some sort of a requirement? Understanding we would have to look at what that would mean in terms of the regulations and what development we might see as a result of that.
Comments? Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah Gustafson here. Definitely want to voice my support for environmental design. I think perhaps an incentive program might give the most flexibility if budget makes it feasible. There are very simple programs out there for homeowners in which you can receive some incentives for converting a certain amount of stormwater or for enhancing that via a rain garden. So I'm wondering what ability is there to maybe, if we don't have the budget for that, give developers a break on some other requirements in exchange for making those environmental leaps.
And I think that's what Ms. Miller was getting at with your comment earlier, that there may be some trade-offs here. It may be that we have to set some priorities, and the commission can make a recommendation to the council as to which you think are the higher priorities. It may be things like environmental design, green building, affordable housing, dedication of open space. All of those things will come into play. As Ms. Miller mentioned, those all add cost to the development and affect what we may or may not see occur there as a result. So, not saying any of them are good or bad, just there will be some trade-offs there. And if you have some particular direction that you want to provide in terms of what you think are the priorities, it would be helpful for us to hear about those now, because then we can work on including those in the plan as well as in the draft regulations. And if I'm misspeaking here, I'm assuming that Bob or Rachel or Bruce will kick me in the shin and say something to correct me.
So do we have a comment from commissioners? Commissioner Vliet, then Aldorks, then Curd.
Yes, I guess after many years of being on the commission, while encouragement is a good thing, I am leaving developers to be able to develop the things that they think are the best for the market value. I think things don't really happen unless you put a little bit of teeth in them. And so I'd like to see something more towards incentive slash requirement with regards to some of these kind of green building energy production techniques, such as a possible requirement of solar arrays or having certain buildings get together and do community solar. You have all these buildings that are over time going to be going upward, I would assume, with with full solar access. And I think it's just great to see from above a bunch of solar panels producing power year round.
Okay. Who was next?
That was me,
Okay.
Chair Aldrich.
Commissioner Alder.
Yep, exactly what Commissioner Fleet said. I guess my question is more procedural. At what point is that the policy question that we're tackling, that we're discussing right now, or will it become a policy question in a future presentation? Let me know.
I'm looking to the other folks. I don't know if it's a policy question at this point. It will become a policy question before you make your recommendation to the city council. And I realize at this point, we can't really give you anything in terms of what those trade-offs might be. So unless I hear somebody saying something else isn't important of the things that we've mentioned, then I think we're going to take a look at it more holistically right now and just see where we think those trade-offs might be, and maybe offer up some options for the commission to consider as we work through the public hearing.
But to clarify, this is something that you would like a recommendation from the commission on before this plan goes to council at the end of the summer. Is that correct?
I think that would be very important, yes, as this goes forward to the council, so that they know where the commission stands and what you're recommending in terms of where your priorities, where you think the priorities should be for Canyon Park in terms of these different aspects of the development, particularly in the development code, as we write in the incentives and the requirements and the deviations that Bob was talking about.
Okay. Did we have someone else? Commissioner Curd, did you have a question, comment?
Thanks. This is Karsten Curd. I wanted to echo the comments made by Commissioner Vliet and Alders. I also want to say, from my perspective, looking at more the natural environment of Canyon Park, there's a really shallow groundwater table in this area, and that precludes a lot of intensive stormwater infiltration throughout this region. And so it ends up being that a lot of the facilities here need to either be detained or put into the city system and dealt with in a community processing area like a detention pond. And so where we see a lot of new development in other parts of the city that allow for infiltration, I think that it's more aspirational to think that might happen in Canyon Park. That being said, our new stormwater regulations that are coming into play are going to really protect the groundwater and surface water of this area. So I think that it's also something that is already kind of written into the code language in terms of protection of the environment. In terms of looking forward in making sure that we're resilient, we're building resilient buildings and making strides and headways into being more climate resilient. I would also like to see, dependence more on renewable energy, but I also think that from a planning perspective, we might be able to affect more change by really re-examining the parking minimums and examining transit-oriented development and pedestrian infrastructure and bicycling infrastructure that might go a little bit further in terms of this, initial planning. A lot of times when we start to get too far into the details of what a developer should put in their structure, it starts eating away at a lot of their other their calculations and their feasibility. And so I just really like to make sure that we're being really flexible here in terms of each individual structure, but on a larger picture, we're looking to make this area more resilient in terms of the environment. Another thing that I just wanted to bring up is that historically on this commission, we've had a really strong aspiration towards affordable housing and workforce housing. If this area is predominantly the economic driver of Bothell, we want to make sure that we're not forgetting affordable housing too. It's an important thing that we should also be looking to make sure that we're encouraging in this area. But as far as what's not important, I think that we might need to kind of regroup and get some ideas of what we might be able to prioritize and deprioritize. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments? Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah Gustafson here. I have a question that might be slightly unrelated to the last few questions, but still related to the passageways and so forth. When I looked at these passageways, I saw places that were absolutely inviting, places where I would feel welcome and comfortable and safe. So I would be excited to walk there. My question, though, is sometimes with the whole eyes on the street idea, to what extent does it sometimes veer into hostile design? I'm wondering if in the where people might not feel so welcome, for example, if they're homeless, for example, but they need to get somewhere. And so my question is, looking at Olympia and other examples of projects where you've worked, has there been any instances where those two great goals have come into conflict? The need to be safe and the need to be welcoming? And if so, how is that resolved? And does that give us any learnings for what we're doing here that we could somehow make a bit more concrete?
Yeah, so the best examples I've seen actually along the West Coast are where it's designed to do both of those things, be welcoming to any user, and design the spaces so that if you know there are people who are going to be using the space who are experiencing homelessness or are street dependent, making sure that there is a space that's visible, but that is their own to use, actually, is where I've seen it work out the best. And so anybody can walk by and feel welcome, but that there are kind of distinct activity areas is what I've seen work out really well. Also, if you have service organizations in the area, including outdoor spaces with those, so that people have a place to go 24/7, that's not, and that actually could be more private to them. So only certain people might be allowed in those areas. I've also seen that work out really well when it's tied to service organizations.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes, Commissioner Gustafson.
Sarah Gustafson here. I'd like to thank Rachel. That opened up a whole new world of visual images to me. And I guess the question that it opens up is, do we expect any of those service organizations would locate to Canyon Park and kind of along the affordable housing level? What kinds of different type of people do we see interacting in the same space? Is it all going to be mostly middle class, or what are we looking at here? Thank you.
I don't think we can predict, but I think that the hope and the strategies behind this are that a wide range of people and all the way lower to higher end could all be welcome.
Yes.
Okay, others? So shall we move on?
Yes, thank you, commissioners. That was excellent, and it'll be good food for thought and guidance for moving forward. I did want to mention that with those through block connection types that you could, again, mix and match on one connection. So perhaps mentioning the fire code and when working with the fire department, there could be, I'm wondering if there are scenarios where you have portions of Woonerf, but then portion in the middle, a small segment, perhaps could be less than 22 feet, provided that the other segments meet their needs. So that brings up some options in my mind that might be explored. So minimum usable on-site outdoor space is the last of the three items that we wanted to cover here tonight, at least introduce the concepts. And let's go to the next slide. So really the intent here is to create a viable set of outdoor space standards to enhance the livability while ensuring that there's some publicly accessible open space. And there's, of course, a lot of other objectives built within that. But the concepts that we've talked about internally would be, so for multifamily, naturally, you'd want to require some usable outdoor space. And so some communities look at X square feet per unit, but since the sizes of units keep changing and they're getting smaller, an approach we've liked more recently, and I think the team here has liked, is using a percentage of gross leasable floor area. And so we'll be coming up with a percentage there that we think is workable and helps achieve the goals. And similarly for non-residential development, so for office, for instance, or large commercial, but it's probably most going to be office or flex tech, you'd look at, again, X% of gross floor area, and that's likely going to be a lot less than what you're looking at for residential. And then you might exempt the smallest development. So you might, hopefully you'll get some small scale, maybe corner storefront spaces in a building. And so you may want to allow flexibility for those. Next slide. So a number of different, well, we're skipping ahead. I think we missed a slide in here too. Can you go back? I think there's, okay, I had a chart and maybe it disappeared. I meant to show, and I don't know what happened to it, but I've worked with a lot of communities. I've got a lot of passion about this topic of integrating open space. And so I had a chart that compared the urban center open space standards between, and this was for Issaquah, but it looked at Bellevue, it looked at Seattle, it looked at Bothell's downtown, because we've been working closely with Issaquah on their open space standards. And recently we had some standards with Mountlake Town Center. But in any case, back to this project and some concepts here. So as far as that minimum usable outdoor space requirement, we'd also be looking to have some parameters to require some publicly accessible outdoor space. And so you might, in some of the zones, require that for some of your close-in zones, but maybe for multifamily developments in the multifamily zones, that maybe it'd be better to, not require some publicly accessible spaces in those zones, because they're harder to make successful, to be honest with you. Then the other types are common outdoor space, which would be those common, like number 2 at the bottom in the middle. So just only the residents have access to it, but it's all residents in a development. And then you want to encourage other types, but maybe not necessarily require things like balconies and private decks. Those are amenities. And unlike the city of Redmond required those in all buildings, but then they started not liking the building design of every unit having a balcony. So I take the approach usually of encouraging, but not requiring them. Next slide. Okay, I think that we've refined. I see what's happened. We've cut down the slides here, probably because we had too many. So we'll get into more detail later, but those are some of the basic concepts for open space.
So commissioners, questions or comments on outdoor space? Commissioner Alders.
Jenny Alders here. I really do appreciate the visuals. There was one in particular, and if you want to go back to that slide, you could, of an outdoor courtyard that looked like it was a public space, and how that might relate to not just the conversation about landscaping, but also, keep going back. That one. Thank you. Okay, so bottom left. That one. Thank you. How, like, I want to specifically draw commissioners' attention to this landscaping here and how that's the kind of thing that could be turned into a rainwater garden. There's lots of kind of green things that you can do with landscaping in a setting like that. And so I see the potential for what these kinds of spaces can be like. I'm also getting, memories of eating on the street in France and throughout Europe in the upper left photo. And so I'm really liking what I'm seeing here, and to have the variety of open spaces that you're describing.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Others? Commissioner Curd.
Thanks, Chair. This is Karsten Curd. We've just spent like a year and a half talking about outdoor space for downtown, and we've seen those comparisons, and we've talked about it at extreme detail and depth. And I'm wondering, from the planning department's perspective, would it be easier if the downtown plan and the Canyon Park plan kind of mesh together a little bit? Or I'm really excited to allow a lot of flexibility in Canyon Park, because it's something that we're willing to wait on, and we want to see it developed right and really good and inviting. And so I struggle because I want it to be very flexible, but I also want it to be easy to permit and something that the planning department has experience with. So could I get a little bit of feedback about what your expectations are between the two areas?
I can respond to that. I've talked with Dave Boyd a lot about this. In fact, we were going to join in on a conference session a year ago on this topic. So I've followed your standards closely. In fact, I've presented to other cities the Bothell case study, of what's working and what's not. And he's been telling me of some updates that you've had. And he's looked closely at some initial concepts I've put together, and we need to have some follow-up discussions. But his thought was, and I think mine too, is we could make this a little different. I don't think they're different contexts, so therefore perhaps it should be a little bit different. But you've learned some things with your downtown experiences, so we're going to draw from that and try to come up with some stuff that we think works good here in this setting. And it may vary by the zones. So again, you want more public space in your inner areas, but at the same time, you don't want to require too much. You don't want to end, in other communities, the helipad open spaces. I've seen some really bad ones in Covington. So we want to be careful. A lot depends on the design. I don't mind having a smaller space if the design is really good, and it depends on the context of what's around it. So a lot of our standards, if the amount is slightly less, it might appear to be, but we really strengthen up the standards for what happens in the space and around the space. So we will provide a lot of the visuals of good examples. So we've spent already some concept stuff that we're looking at with internally, have a lot of details on what's the minimum required, looking at seating, landscaping, amenities, what fronts the space, is it open 24 hours a day? So all of that stuff, we dig in pretty deeply. And we've learned from working with landscape architects and other park planners, for instance, and Issaquah and other projects. So we are kind of integrating some language that we think has worked well elsewhere.
And I would echo what Bob said. I think we are trying to get these to mesh, but as he said, they're not going to be identical because I think there is some overlap. Some of the purposes overlap in terms of what each is trying to achieve, but not all of them. So it's a little bit different in that respect. So we may see some differences in terms of the ratios that would be required, for example, and how that might be applied in the two different areas. One of the things that that I hope to get out of this, at least, is some consistency in the terminology. So we haven't gotten there yet. I kind of like the terminology that Bob has been using so far. So you may see some changes when we bring this back to the commission for the downtown. But I think generally, yes, we are trying to achieve that. And I also want to mention, Bob, that they have seen that that table that you mentioned, the chart. Dave has shared that with them.
Okay.
So they've seen that in the past in terms of comparisons with what other jurisdictions do.
Good.
I think that
Thanks.
was focused
Yes.
more on downtown areas, as I recall.
Although I do believe we have some new commissioners who may not have seen that. Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah Gustafson here. I think there's been a lot of focus on the built environment. I'm also wondering if it makes any sense to talk about the human environment at these places, whether it makes any sense to set up guidelines saying, well, we want to encourage the owners of these spaces to do community events like concerts or something like that. And I know that's really veering a lot into prescriptive territory. And I think I'm willing to just let that go, but I do also want to see if we have some standards for the owners about, well, this is when you do or don't call the police on somebody who is in your space. So those are some thoughts brainstorming about the human environment. And I would like to hear if other commissioners have thoughts.
And I can just give a real quick response to that staff standpoint, if that's okay. I think part of what you're talking, it's a great question, and I think something that oftentimes gets lost in the discussion about the built environment. We tend to focus more on that. It's more tangible and something that we can deal with more easily. I think some of what you're talking about are broader policy discussions and procedural things that the city would need to talk about citywide versus in individual spaces. In terms of activities in these areas, I think that is a really good point. And typically we don't require that, but it depends on the circumstances. So one area where we do require that, for example, is the POP. Because they put the public space on the second story, up above the street level, we were concerned that it wouldn't necessarily get the use or the public wouldn't know it was there and make use of that as a public space. So part of the agreement that we arrived, one of the conditions we put on that was that they would need to provide some level of social activities for, I think, the first 6 months that it was open. Pandemic has sort of altered that for the time being. We'll see where that ends up playing out. But I could see us looking at that. I wouldn't necessarily put it as a requirement in the code, but I think it would be something that as staff we would look at in terms of where the space is located, what types of activities we want to see there, how accessible is that, and we might encourage that type of thing to occur. My other expectation as a planner, and I'll look to my colleagues here for a nod if they agree with this, is that if we design these in a way that encourages that type of public activity, then that type of programming will happen organically. And that's ultimately, I think that would be one of our measures of success.
Commissioner Vliet.
This is Commissioner Vliet. Thank you for all these great discussions and questions. Speaking of the built environment and public spaces, public open spaces, I don't really want to. I just want to voice my, I guess, my favoritism towards looking into shading issues with regards to buildings, and that's kind of one of the reasons I like to see variance in buildings. And maybe as you go towards the center, it gets higher, kind of depending on where you are with regards to the sun. There's a big part of the year where the sun's low. And so a lot of those places, while they may look great in the summertime, I don't know how good they would, how much purpose they would serve 5 months out of the year, 5, 6 months out of the year. And that was it. That was just more of a comment. I don't know quite how you can, I guess, and require that, but that gets pretty tough. But I just want to throw it out there.
Okay, other Commissioner Olson.
This is Amanda Olson. I am not quite sure how to phrase this, and I don't know if you can regulate to it, but with the open spaces, I think some of the most compelling places that I spend a lot of time with my family in normal times are places where you can kind of spend like a long morning into the afternoon. So maybe you have like one errand, like you're returning something at a store, or preferably buying something at a store, and then you can kind of maybe there's a small play area or just an interesting space where your kid can play. You can grab a coffee, you can sit and chill for a while, you can go to another couple stores. Like, I guess I I think sometimes public open space is just kind of like a bench. Like, I would really think if this is going to be a nice interconnected neighborhood area, we'd want to see a lot of sort of different like mini activity types. Like, and I don't know if that makes any sense, but just I really would hope this would be sort of an interconnected space where you can do a lot of different things while you're going between the businesses that are there.
Commissioner Alders.
Yes.
This is Jenny Aldrich. I wanted to echo what Commissioner Olson said. I'm remembering the hours and hours I would spend at U Village with my toddlers, and how there were lots of little places that, even though they were quite small, it could just be, the spitting turtle fountain. Like, we went from place to place, like the fountain over there to the fountain over there to the playground to the store that had a place, like a play area in it. And we would spend hours there. And I really would like to see a place like that in Bothell for our families, especially for our young children.
Okay, thank you. Others? All right, I think we're perhaps ready to move on from the urban design. I heard us talk about environmental design, open public space, and touch a little bit on affordable housing. So I guess you'll ask us for some recommendations before we're through.
Was there any more to the presentation?
No, that's it.
I saw questions come up, so I thought.
And just to clarify, that was it for the regulation-oriented presentation, but we did want to talk a little bit about the economic development chapter and then a little follow-up on transportation policy direction.
Okay.
Are there more slides for that, Rachel?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Same PowerPoint, I hope?
Yes.
Before you dive in, I thought I saw Commissioner Olson raise a hand before we.
I did, yeah. Are we able to take a break in the next little while at some point?
Probably a good time to do that.
Okay, let's break right now. I've got 7:38 on the clock there, so 5 minutes. That work for everyone?
Sure.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break and be back at now 7:44. reconvening the Bothell Planning Commission at 7:45, continuing our discussion of the Canyon Park Subarea Plan update.
And if we may return to the presentation. Oh, thank you, Michael.
Okay, here we go. So you all, I believe, have seen a draft version of the economic development chapter as well. And this hopefully is a very quick discussion. One of the highlights of this project has been the cluster of life sciences, biotech, medical businesses that are already located in the area. And we've had the opportunity to talk with Life Sciences of Washington and see what work they think would benefit the businesses out here. And one of the things they've suggested is a life science cluster designation. And what I understand is that this would be a commitment from the city to promote the area as a life sciences cluster. And I'll just echo that I think a lot of our urban design strategies and land use strategies are also doing the same kinds of things to support the businesses that are here and ones that may come in the future. So this hopefully is a quick question. Should the city explore this? A life sciences cluster.
Commissioner Vliet.
This is Commissioner Vliet. Yes, it should.
Commissioner Alderks.
Jenny Aldrich's here. Yes, it should.
Commissioner Gustafson.
Sarah Gustafson here. This sounds like a win. Is there any con to this? Would it cost the city a lot of money? Would it disadvantage other businesses?
No, our understanding, we've been kind of working with a little bit with the Life Sciences of Washington on this. This is kind of thing that you do to kind of help self-promote the area and to even attract even more businesses and employees, because what you do is you start telling them what you have here, which is very unique.
Commissioner Curd.
This is Commissioner Curd. I concur. We should. I also have a quick question. Driving into Bothell on 522 from Woodinville, Monroe area, there's a sign that says Bothell Innovation Zone. Is that similar to what the city would probably be using to identify this as a, is it like signage, but also just, yeah, I don't know.
A little bit. The innovation zone was kind of an interesting thing that was really hot a number of years ago, as basically for biomedical devices more than it is anything else. And we made a lot of really successful company attractions with that. So I think this would be building upon that kind of a success. And it is one of those items that I think is just kind of exciting because it gives your area an identity. I think that would be really fun to have.
So is there a substantive commitment required from the city to do this?
Not a substantive commitment. Basically, what it would be is that our economic development manager would just have one more tool as she starts promoting the community to different businesses. And it's just kind of a nice way to recognize, one, the companies that we have out there, and the other is to just say, hey, look, we are a very interesting area, and it gets our name out there, the city of Bothell's name out there for life sciences clusters. It sounds like a really fun and very interesting approach.
And it would also then be on the list and be promoted by the state association that does promotion of these life science clusters.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I did hear Mr. Blanet also speak favorably about that. So, okay, so I saw a lot of nodding heads on that. Is staff looking for anything else from the commission on this question?
No, that was an easy one. Thank you.
Thought it might be.
Good to have some of those.
Okay. Yeah, right alongside that, part of what can help this be a really exciting area and one that's welcoming for all members of Bothell's community is this idea of affordable commercial and cultural anchor space. And so what we mean by that is buildings that can accommodate existing businesses that are already there in the area now, but then also when it redevelops, continuing to support the types of businesses that are out there now. And so as we've noted in other discussions, there are a number of cultural anchors in the area, restaurants and groceries that serve some of Bothell's people of color, and then also startups and entrepreneurs, small businesses, local businesses, this gymnastics area or Seakai Run, all kinds of really interesting little businesses that need lower rent spaces or large flexible spaces. So there's kind of two things at play here, two types of businesses that we're talking about here. So some of the strategies that we've put into the sub-area plan are, one, in the employment zones, removing the residential development pressure. What we saw was that when any covenants that were in that area that had formally restricted residential, when any of those were lifted, residential came in and was developed in this area, which then is going to be there for a long time. And so then these types of businesses wouldn't be able to develop there. So that's one thing, just reducing the development pressure that might displace or prevent businesses from being in the area. And then design is a big one. One of the most expensive things in running a business, particularly if you're moving into a new area, if you're a new business or if you're moving into the area into a new building, is upgrading the space to your needs. So restaurants and groceries, restaurants in particular, have very specific ventilation needs. And so having a high enough ceiling to accommodate that HVAC is really important. If you have any arts-oriented uses, it's also got to be high enough for the types of uses and wide enough spans between columns to allow for people viewing. If you have dancers, think of two people, one on top of the other, or a person being tossed in the air. Not that that's necessarily the use that we're going to see in Canyon Park right away, but they are things that can be built into the design of the building and takes one of those costs away from a business that's trying to make ends meet right at the beginning of their time here. So flexible ground floors that are open for the range of uses that might come in, and that can be divided up into small spaces and enlarged as businesses change. So that idea of entries, and whether an entry is used right away or not isn't that important. But if you can have two entries side by side, you accommodate two small businesses. If that business expands, then you have a larger business. And the idea of co-working spaces and condoization is pretty important. So flexibility is the word that I keep coming back to here. So building that flexibility in right away. Another thing you can do is maximum retail size limits, except for groceries and hardware stores. They really need a lot of space sometimes. Or doing an average amount of space, or like the depth, an average depth. And that can get at supporting smaller businesses and not having it be only for large businesses. And that has an added benefit of adding a level of activity at the ground floor level, particularly on your pedestrian neighborhood center streets. And then we have a general strategy in there as well as partnering with nonprofits and preservation development authorities. We're seeing these are some of the best ways to support affordable commercial space, whether that's truly commercial or if it's more like a nonprofit or social service organization or a cultural anchor of some other type. And these are really key to making sure that affordability is maintained over time and that the space is managed in a way that tenants can come in even if they don't have a lot of capital or cash to work with, especially at the beginning of their time as a business. So that we wanted to put those strategies out there and cover the types of things that we have been looking at and putting into the sub-area plan. Bruce, we didn't add a specific question about this, but what do you think we should ask for comments, or what do you think?
I think we just open the floor up to have some discussion about this. It's one of the things that I found very interesting is that the entrepreneurial spirit was so high within this area that I think that we want to make sure we do that preservation. And just to reiterate the whole notion of having areas designated for employment so they don't have to compete against the residential. Residential unfortunately, is more nimble and has a little bit more ability to go into these areas. We did lose some pieces of property to residential that would have ordinarily been some type of a flex building where we could have had these types of activities. So that's a really important strategy that we've implemented here. So I think I'd just like to hear the commission, identify what kind of concepts they'd like to discuss, and we'll go from there.
So commissioners, questions, comments? Commissioner Alderks and then Gustafson.
Jenny Alderks here. Thank you for bringing this, to discussion. My particular question is, how does this kind of replace the loss of Country Village and some of those, like, they were very affordable business spaces, and so I guess I'm just looking for a price comparison between what businesses were able to pay at Country Village to what they would be paying in some of these anchor spots that you're describing.
I will say new space is expensive, and that's why I'm harping on the flexible space that helps reduce some of those startup costs.
And I would also note that Country Village was a pretty unique situation. That was a place where there was a natural tendency to have really inexpensive retail rents, just from the standpoint that the gentleman moved in a bunch of old buildings and kind of made use of those. And that's the kind of thing that's just so difficult to duplicate, particularly if you're talking about new buildings. The best we can do is identify this flexibility in these spaces and having that capacity built into these areas.
The other thing I might add is that the third point is the partnerships with community land trusts and preservation development authorities. Hopefully you guys can hear me over my kids. The successes that we're seeing in Seattle and other places are where Africa Town or even Pike Place Market with their Preservation Development Authority, Chinatown ID, Preservation Development Authorities working there. So the successes we see in maintaining and keeping affordable commercial space and cultural anchors are where there's a host of people working on it. So it's got to come from a community backing as well.
Okay, Commissioner Gustafson, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Sarah Gustafson here. Well, first of all, this is so exciting. Thank you for really taking some of the questions that we have been asking and extending them into the future. I really, really like the idea of historical preservation as a means of preserving affordable rents. Such a powerful concept. I think we could get the Landmarks Board in on this too. As you said, the more people we have working towards that goal, perhaps the more investment we'll have in that goal from a city perspective. So let's go. That's awesome. I have one concern, and then I'll end with one other really good thing that I saw there. My one concern about the difference between the office nodes and the residential nodes is that, from my very limited knowledge, it seems to me that a lot of the cultural anchors are concentrated in the orange node that will turn residential. So I'm wondering if we can still keep that business-friendly aspect there, even if they're an orange node, and I might be mistaken on the geography here. And then, so that's my question. But the other thing I wanted to mention was that the flexible space ground floor is so awesome, and I'd love to hear more about ways that could be flexible, just the doors, the other requirements, and just digging more into that. So 3 points. Thank you.
Could I clarify historic preservation? I'm not sure I was entirely going there when I said preservation development authorities. Some of the examples I brought up are, but you can have a new building with a PDA that helps to manage a space. So it doesn't have to be putting any of the buildings that are out there right now onto a historic register.
And I'm not so sure we have very many buildings that would register anyway, because this is a fairly new area. Relative terms.
So can you say a little bit about how the city might bring in a PDA into this area? What are tools that they may have?
Yeah, so I've seen cities act as facilitators, and then if there is a city commitment and city funding, they can do grant programs. Like, for example, City of Seattle has an equitable development initiative right now, and they, they had a piece of property they were able to sell and make a bunch of money and dedicate towards equitable development work. And they've been able to give grants to community organizations to figure this stuff out. They were able to help a nonprofit build their capacity to become a community land trust. So if a city can act as a facilitator amongst existing organizations, a lot of affordable housing nonprofits are getting into this and getting much more interested in affordable ground floor space, not just affordable housing. So Capitol Hill Housing in Seattle and organizations like that might be really good partners for the city to just see how they can help.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, questions? Commissioner Vliet.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Aldrich, for mentioning a country village. That was a sad day when I think we lost about 50 small businesses, which I knew wouldn't be coming back. They can't afford, most of the businesses there could not afford new builds. So thank you, Rachel, for bringing us this idea of flexible buildings. That would be great to be able to bring back a lot of, I think, small kind of unique businesses that really make cities vibrant. Thank you.
Commissioner Olson.
This is more of a procedure scope question, but is there an opportunity to recommend to council, maybe when we send this over to them, that they somehow reserve some space for incubator spaces in Canyon Park?
Mm. Mm.
You can certainly make that recommendation. I'm trying to think of the practical application of that and how that would be done. If the city doesn't own the space, I don't know that we can require that it be reserved or preserved without some sort of a, if we treated it like affordable housing, for example, and we required a low rent for commercial space, there would have to be some offset that the city would be able to provide for them to require them to do that, or even to incentivize them to do that. So I'm not familiar with how that's done other places. I'm sure it is done other places. I'm just not familiar with it. I don't know, Rachel, if you know of any place that does that for commercial space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there are maker spaces and incubator spaces are usually managed by nonprofits. I should look back at the city of Twist because they did a big partnership with a nonprofit in managing a space. But again, I think it's all partnerships. I can come back with more information.
And it makes a lot of sense that this is something that you would collaborate with others on. This is one of those things that's a natural to say, look, you work with other jurisdictions, you work with some of your other agencies, you even work with maybe your economic development organizations. It's going to be one of those things that's going to take a village, if you would, forgive me the pun, to get this kind of thing going.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that, the TWISP example is one where it's the city relying more on a community organization or a nonprofit or something like that, because most cities, unless you're a really large city, you don't have the capacity. We don't have the capacity to put something like that together.
Yeah.
So that's where that partnership is really critical. So I would say that, you know, you can make a recommendation to explore partnerships to accomplish that or something along
Yeah.
those lines. Sorry, that's a rather long answer to your very straightforward question.
Commissioner Curd.
Thanks, Chair. This is Karsten Kurd. I just wanted to make it unanimous that this is a really important thing. We've heard from all the other commissioners, and I just wanted to make sure that I'm echoing what they say, and I think that this is super important that we proceed. So thanks for bringing this up and for making it a priority.
Okay. Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. I did want to go back to the question of the zoning and just make sure we had an answer to the question of whether concentrating residential in the area where I understand most of the cultural anchors are, would that affect those businesses, or would they just kind of be grandfathered there and hang out? Would it affect those businesses or other similar businesses in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I think displacement is an issue anywhere in any of the zones. And so I'll say the overarching strategy is that in new development, we accommodate the same types of businesses. Another strategy that I can't remember actually if we put a recommendation in there is relocation assistance. That's another one that we sometimes put into plans. We could talk about that one. If a place is being physically displaced, not just economically displaced. And Bruce, we could revisit the residential areas and what flexibility there is. Of course, if a business is there right now and it's not getting redeveloped, it would remain. But if the area is redeveloped, I do wonder if we should revisit, you know, if for some reason they really wanted to stay on that corner right there, if, you know, corner stores or something can still be in those residential areas.
Yeah, let's take another look at it. I thought we had some flexibility, but
Yeah,
I want to, yeah, we should take another gander at that.
we'll take another look.
Yeah,
One
I
of the
think
drivers on residential was transit access too.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and there's some things that we can look at from a land use standpoint. We don't have a lot of ability to influence what the economics of the situation are going to be. So whenever we see redevelopment, that's going to push rents up, and that is going to displace some businesses that have those lower cost rents right now. So unless we're able to do something like Rachel was talking about with some sort of a community-based organization that can provide additional funding and subsidies for rents or things like that, then I think we're going to be limited in how we can address that. It's a very important issue, and I'm not minimizing it at all. It is a serious consideration that we have to look at. Just want to be clear, there's only so much we can do from a planning and land use standpoint.
Okay. Other commissioner comments, questions?
I'll just clarify, our residential areas are mixed use. So I think commercial uses would be allowed. They're just not the emphasis of the zone.
But I think the point is still valid that if we see redevelopment into mixed use types of projects, there's the likelihood that the existing businesses, particularly the ones that are paying a lower rent right now, would be displaced by that.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. My concern is that I don't think we can be overly optimistic about the role of nonprofits here because of COVID and the economic circumstances. And I actually think of myself as a pretty free market type of person. But I do want to at least raise this question and maybe get some feedback from other commissioners so we can do the trade-off. Is the benefit of redeveloping this area into a vibrant transit-oriented area worth the potential cost to lower rents, to diverse businesses, to cultural anchors in this area? Thank you.
Comments, anyone? Commissioner Vliet.
I guess I think it is to that point. Surely, from in my mind, for a lot of an updating with regards to some of the environmental codes, I think redevelopment will potentially help with changing a lot of 1980s land use policy. And so, from that point, at the same time, I completely understand the point with regards to cultural anchors. But I feel like we've done a lot of work on this for the last couple of years. And I do think we should proceed with this.
Yeah, I might add, this is also a long-range plan, and I don't anticipate anything will happen very rapidly in the next couple of years. We're just looking forward. So, but Commissioner Alders.
Thank you, Chair. I would just echo the concern for these cultural anchors and just how important they are to our community, and especially immigrant and refugee communities who are coming into into a new town that they've never lived in before. And how much the city itself benefits from those people coming and those businesses being here. And I'm still keenly feeling the pain of not having those affordable business spaces at Country Village for people who are getting started. And I'm not hearing any solutions on how to keep those rents as affordable as possible, beyond we can make it flexible, and we can maybe come up with partnerships, but the rate, like the market rate, is going to be the market rate of these places. It's going to be expensive. The rates will probably increase as new development comes in. There will be displacement, and I don't want to overlook the impact that will have on individuals, on business owners, and also just on our community.
Okay, Commissioner Olson.
One benefit of adding more retail space is right now, my understanding is it's pretty hard to get a space. There's not a lot available. I have a friend who's wanted to start a business for a while, and there's just not a lot that comes up. You have to be fast. You have to snag it. So I do have to think that an increase in just the amount of available space is going to help people secure space. I would very much like to see. I always call it affordable commercial space. I don't think that's a real term, but I do hope that the city and a nonprofit can somehow snag a lot and make a cool space, kind of like Kenmore did, where they have a space where you can start a business, and I think that'd be really cool. I just don't know that we can affect that through planning and land use, as Director Cotterman said. So it's very interesting to me, and that's something I'm gonna start talking to my friends about. But it's just, I don't know how much we can affect on the just the market rate of commercial space, but I do think having more space will help. And I'll stop there because I'm just saying the same things.
And I know that we've already done some research in this, and Rachel and Bruce have talked to that. I think we can also talk with our economic development manager some more and see if maybe there's some other strategies that we haven't explored yet. I don't know if there are, but we can certainly, obviously this is important to the commission, and understandable. So we'll see if there's some more ideas out there, strategies that we can include.
Commissioner Gustafson first, and then Rachel.
Thank you, Chair. I do believe that the only real tool we have at our disposal right now is zoning, because that really shapes the economic value of land. And almost as a thought experiment, I'd wonder what would happen is if we made those spaces where the cultural anchors are, excuse me, make those into the pink spaces. What are they called?
Residential medium.
The office residential as opposed to the residential. And what would happen if we took some of those spaces that are already where the established businesses are, the purple spaces, and made them into pink spaces too, going back to my original question a few meetings ago, but just kind of evening out the burden between the smaller immigrant businesses and the larger, more established businesses. This could be economic chaos. I am not necessarily recommending it. I just want to get that idea on the table.
I can tell you that our capacity and buildable lands analysis would suffer greatly if we made a lot of changes of that nature at this point. We're really well balanced right now in our meeting our capacity as well as our transportation impacts, and I would hate to have to revisit that again.
And if I could add to that, the biggest pressure that affordable commercial space is seeing is the loss of general commercial land. Those areas are residential is already allowed. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, we lost most of what you said.
We lost. He has bad.
Yes. Rachel, you were going in slow motion and then you just froze. Rachel? Rachel?
So that pressure is already there. And the means of preserving. Oh no. All right, am I back?
Yes.
Am I back?
Yes. We lost about a minute and a half of whatever you were saying.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh no. What's going on? Hello.
Oh, you can't hear us.
Wow. Okay. So the biggest pressure on commercial space is the loss of general commercial. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
We are in a definite time here.
You know what? I could change one thing about my connectivity. So let me see if that can help. Give me 1 minute.
You're coming through fine right now.
Okay.
Oh. Okay. Well, I could keep talking then. Am I still coming through?
Yes.
Oh, geez. What was that train of thought? Commercial affordability, the loss of general commercial lands. Thrasher's Corner and Canyon Park Place already allow residential, so that pressure is already there. The commercial areas east of North Creek and Phillips, although technically they allow residential, there were covenants that did not allow it for a long time. So it's not seen as a down zone. We're not taking away an allowed use by keeping that there. So it's a strategy that I actually haven't been able to use in other places to remove a residential category. So that's kind of the cool thing about preserving that as commercial space. I think it helps preserve commercial affordability. There was another point I wanted to add. There's another strategy. There is a limit in the state of Washington on how cities can use funds to support business. You probably have run into this before. You can't directly support a business. It's considered a gift to a business, and unless it's like really specific about supporting the poor and infirm, you can't help that business pay their rent. However, there are very good ways to use funding that is not state funding to support businesses. So federal funding can be used. So CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding, can be used to support businesses. And then this other way of working through nonprofits, you can have foundation funding and lots of other funding types that the city could help manage or work with another organization again to more directly support business.
Okay. Other questions, comments, commissioners? A lot of interest in this area.
Yes.
Did you get feedback you can use and move forward?
Yes.
Okay.
Keep the section in the sub-area plan and beef it up even more if we can, is what I heard.
All right. So those are questions and comments. Transportation.
Yes. So we did want to come back and check in on the transportation preferred alternative. And the question today is about bat lanes on Bothell Everett Highway. The way that the sub-area plan is drafted today is that in the near term, or as we stand today, that we would keep the general purpose lanes as general purpose and wait on the bat lanes until there is regional support for it. And what this allows us to do is that with that 214th Street extension and with the expected growth or the level of growth that is planned for in this planning horizon, we would actually maintain a level of service E on Bothell Everett Highway. Again, if 214th doesn't go through, then we trip over that threshold. If we could go to the next slide, please. So if we put the bat lanes in today, the way things are designed now, so if those general purpose lanes convert to bat lanes, you can see that with or without the 214th Street extension, Bothell Everett Highway trips over into that level of service F, kind of no matter what you do. So we wanted to check in and see if the way that it's stated in the transportation approach it rings true for you, that bat lanes are a excellent goal and a great way to support transit priority in through Canyon Park, but that it's dependent on regional support. So getting community transit, WashDOT, Snohomish County, all working together, looking at the corridor as a whole and making sure that it can work together. So next slide, please. So some of the things we've thought about in the way that we couch that in the draft plan right now is that the Green Line's not likely to see a greater than 10-minute headway in the foreseeable future. So even if bat lanes were put in place today, we can't necessarily say that we'd move more people, even if we make that really great investment in much faster transit through this little segment. And that little segment is another big point. By making this change here, yes, you may shave off a couple minutes in this segment, but in your overall travel time for much longer trips, this segment before there's regional support could be described as a bridge to nowhere without bat lanes extending farther north or south. And so if we're not improving per person throughput and not significantly moving the dial on transit desirability, we don't have a strong case for updating the city LOS policy today to make these bat lanes possible in this plan. So we're trying to make sure that that rings true for you, the way that's described. So I think we can go to the next slide. It has the actual question. So should the installation of the bat lanes along the Bothell Everett Highway wait for the completion of a regional coordination effort? Or is there a reason to refocus and try to push that through sooner than that?
Commissioner Olson.
I think it makes sense to wait for a regional effort. It doesn't seem like the payoff before that is really worth like the investment to me.
Commissioner Curd.
Hi, this is Carson Curd. So I'm on the fence about this because the City of Bothell segment of the Green Line is the slowest portion of the Green Line. And so I don't see it as a bridge to nowhere because it would be improving the slowest portion. It would be improving that like narrowest part of the hourglass, if you will. And so I would anticipate that introduction of bat lanes might increase the feasibility of people to make the decision to switch to using Swift or rapid transit instead of driving. It's also partially, for me personally, it's about reprioritizing how we want to be moving people. And while it might be aspirational to, start investing more in mass transportation and disinvesting in single occupancy vehicles, I understand that we're in like a transition period right now, and that we do need to kind of serve the community where we're at now. It's just a really hard decision because I don't foresee 3 or 4 different jurisdictions ever joining hands and working together on a project like of this magnitude. And so I might be more comfortable with this approach if the right-of-way is reserved for extra bat lanes in the future. If this is how we have to proceed, then I don't want to let go that that bat lane possibility in the future if the conditions change, or yeah, I just like to be more flexible, and I am more aspirational, but it's a difficult decision for me.
To be clear, the bat lanes would still be in the plan, but just pending, full regional support. So there wouldn't be anything in there that precludes them.
And I think I would add that community transit is very interested in bat lanes, and they are an important partner in this discussion. And I think that there is some genesis for hope that we could get some movement on bat lanes up and down that corridor.
Commissioner Olson.
It's me again. Has community transit weighed in on sort of the island of bat lanes, just in the Bothell part? Have they said, oh, that's a good idea? Or like, what's their take on that, if they've given one?
Yeah, Bruce, you may recall more being in that meeting, but what I've understood is that they're very supportive of it.
Yeah, they really do believe firmly in bat lanes. And so I think if you ask them pointed, they say, hey, we want bat lanes wherever we can get them. It's just, is it the right time to do it now or sooner rather than a little bit later and do a little bit more of this coordination?
Okay, Commissioner Aldarks.
Thank you, Jenny Aldrich here. I guess my concern is, are we going to let a situation continue to get worse and worse before we implement bat lanes? I'm hearing what Commissioner Curd is saying, especially about the importance of, like, how do you increase the viability and the desirability of the Green Line if you aren't working to get it going faster? How are you going to encourage people to transition over to it if it continues to be slow? And we say that we are putting that off to for those riders and drivers. I don't see how saying because it's not good, we'll get more people on it later. I guess they seem kind of contradictory to me. And so I don't like those times that you're showing us on those charts.
Very painful.
But I definitely think that we have to, I think it's important to prioritize the speed of buses in order to create trust and desire to ride buses.
There is also an interim step that we included in the plan, and that's transit signal priority. So even without bat lanes, there are ways to speed up the buses with an impact to particularly side streets coming into Bothell Everett Highway. For general purpose on those side streets, they might get slowed down a little bit waiting for the buses to get through the signal.
And I think that the desire on everyone's part, I think, is to help speed up the buses and make them more attractive in terms of an alternative to driving. And that is what the plan is geared toward doing. The challenge that we have right now, I think, is twofold. One is the effect that it has on the overall level of service. If we convert 2 general purpose lanes to the BAT lanes. And the second is this isn't something that the city can do on its own. It really will take a regional agreement in order for this to happen because it's WashDOT right of way, it's community transit service, and it's also going to flow into unincorporated Snohomish County as part of this as well. So I think those two things are why, from the staff standpoint, we're looking at this as we don't want to let it go. We want to keep it in the plan, but we also want to put together a plan that we think is going to achieve something in the short term as well as the long term.
Commissioner Vliet.
Yes, this is Commissioner Vliet. I think I would have to agree with Rachel's assessment on this and what Michael Cotterman just repeated. Basically, it is going to take a regional approach. It's going to take a lot of cash dollars to make this happen. I'd like to leave it in the plan, but to really work, and I think Snohomish County is changing, in my mind, in a good way over time. And so I think historically, where it may have been more of an unachievable aspiration to get the areas to work together, I foresee that becoming less of an issue over time. And so I would like to kind of go with what Rachel recommended in there. But with the idea that any kind of development that comes in, we want to make sure that whatever's going in place is taking into the concept of bat lanes in the future and Batmobiles.
I'll be back in the light in a minute. There we go. Yeah, Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah Gustafson here. My question is there any economic or budget impact to the city to implement bat lanes sooner rather than later? My understanding is that there is none, that the main impact we are looking at is traffic. Is that correct, or am I missing something?
There are costs associated with converting from general purpose to bat lanes, but it's not huge. It's not like you're constructing a brand new roadway or anything like that.
Yeah, we're fortunate that there was already a comprehensive plan project on the books to add the final piece of the puzzle that would make it possible, which is the 7th lane on the north end, so that there's a 7-lane cross section, which would allow for bat lanes on either side.
Commissioner Gustafson.
Thank you for that answer. That makes a lot of sense. Based on that answer, my thought would be to do the bat lanes sooner rather than later. My reason for that is at this point, I do not put so much weight on that table we were shown for 2 reasons. First is that it shows vehicle throughput, not person throughput, as we've discussed earlier. And the second is it's just a snapshot in time. It's 2043. I don't know if it would be that bad in 2033. And I also think that by the time 2053 or 2063 rolls around, induced demand is going to be so great that everything is going to be level F for cars. So with that in mind, the big picture is transit, and that's what we really need to do as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, other commissioners? Rachel.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we did look at through person input or through person. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we did not see a gain, and that comes back to the Green Line headways and just the amount of buses. And so that's another reason to wait on the regional approach. Is if there are a lot more buses coming through, then yes, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Thank you. Great clarification.
Okay, others. Commissioner Alders.
Jenny Aldrich here. My question is, if we were to do bat lanes sooner than later, isn't that still dependent upon this community partnership between jurisdictions, or is that something that Bothell can do without that partnership lined up?
We would certainly, it's certainly a partnership with community transit. And then at the border of Bothell and Snohomish County, Bruce, it sounds like you might have been about to weigh in.
Well, I was just going to say, certainly you could have bat lanes suddenly appear when you got to the city of Bothell's city limits. But what happened is, as soon as they left those city limits, they'd be going back into general purpose lanes.
Okay, thank you for that. My understanding is that it doesn't make sense to do it without a partnership, and so get the partnership before you do it. Am I understanding is this conversation flowing in that way? Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, it's
Okay, others?
This is Steve Morikawa. Could I provide a little bit of input as well?
Sorry, I forgot you were there.
Sure, please chime in.
Okay. I think, Bruce and Rachel are walking a fine line, and everybody, including Public Works, really wants to push transit. The difficult part we're having right now is we're kind of at the end of the line for the Swift line, and they need to take a left turn into the business park. So at some point, they need to leave that bat lane. And that's kind of scaring us a little bit as well, because if you have a straight bat lane, you can bypass a lot of things. But if you got to start taking left turns and then start coming out again, it gets a little dicey. The other concern we have is it's very interesting the way we check our level of service. If you look at the chart that we showed, the level of service on 527, from a second point of view, on average for each intersection, doesn't look that bad. But that corridor is actually measuring it from 524 all the way to 522. And there's not much change in the ones to the south. So it's somewhat skewed the impact on that very short 0.9 mile stretch. And where you're going to gain a couple minutes delay is literally on that stretch. And once you get south of 228, the intersection performance doesn't change much at all. One of the other things that we have to be concerned about is if we implement bat lanes right away and our level of service drops to F, and not only F, but we have a lot of delay, we're right next to I-405. And WashDOT is concerned that if we start affecting the ramps, that it starts affecting the heavier traffic that's going up and down I-405 as well. So there's a lot of balance that we're trying to do. I think the city is really pushing transit. We also, we have committed, and if the plan is going through as we have it outlined now, in putting 20th Avenue North to 524, and that actually would provide another route for local CT buses, which they have expressed a keen interest in using that route because it would be probably a lot more reliable than being on 527. So this delicate balance is going back and forth. And the last thing I want to say is we still have to actually add lanes before we can convert them to bat lanes, which will cost us some money as well. So it's not like if we say we're going to put bat lanes, it's going to happen in 2 or 3 years. We have to get the money to build the lanes to be able to convert the lanes. So all this combined, I think, is leading us toward trying to push transit, making sure we get TDM working so that we get less traffic as much as possible. Start exploring TSP, traffic signal priority, transit signal priority as soon as possible, and start the process of working with the region. But it's very difficult, I think, to promise that everything will work right away, right off the bat.
Commissioner Curd.
Thanks. This is Karsten Curd. Thanks for that clarification. I feel like the discussion recently in council has been more towards looking at long-term, costs and operational costs long-term. And I just feel like if we push off, there's a part of me that feels like if we push off bat lanes until, 2040, it's just going to cost more later. And so part of like building out the infrastructure is in anticipation of this growth and of the additional use. And it's hard for me to accept that we're planning to be reactive after something has kind of gone haywire in the end. That being said, I do understand, the costs and the what would be required to put in bat lanes now, and it might not affect the movement throughout this area as much as we might be hoping now. So if we do decide to push bat lanes off, we need to be so aggressive on these passive measures like signal prioritization, jumping lights for transit, and transit demand management or traffic demand management as well. So those are critical. I can't overstate how critical those are, because if we don't prioritize transit and if we don't make it more lucrative and more time saving for people to make that switch, it's not going to happen. So it's somewhat of a disappointment, and I don't want to I don't want to just let go of bat lanes because I feel like this option is for all intents and purposes letting go of bat lanes. But I guess if that's the realistic outcome, I think we just need to be so aggressive with TDM and others.
Well, my sense is if we're talking about bat lanes after the extension of 214th, and if we're talking to the extension of 214th after the 9th Avenue safety improvements, we're quite a ways off. Mr. Kurd?
Thanks. We're quite a ways off if we don't address this until 2043 too. So yeah, putting it in the queue is also aspirational, but there's some, this is long-term planning here.
Sure. Other comments, questions on this?
Rachel, don't you have a text in there that recommends the study of a bat lanes on the corridor?
Yes, we did add that recommendation that we should do a regional corridor study that looks at bat lane options, intersection options, especially that 228 Bothell Highway intersection. But yes, so I'm hearing loud and clear that we need to prioritize that study as well as all the steps that need to happen before implementing bat lanes.
Yeah, and one of the things I would like to point out, I'm typically on the implementation end. I just so happen to have a transportation planner under me as well, so we look long term. But my group is a lot of engineers who like to actually build the thing and make it work and actually see it come to fruition. So one of the things I'm trying to make sure I voice, and Rachel and Bruce have had to listen to me, is essentially that when we go to council or when we go to the elected bodies and the planning commission, I think we need to tell you what needs to be done in order to implement this. As an example, you said TDM is very important. I totally agree. One of the things that coming out of COVID-19 is we see a lot less traffic and people telecommuting, and it's potentially working for a lot of people that they didn't think it's going to work. And you could put a lot of transportation planners out of business if you could cut traffic by 25% just by doing this. We wouldn't even be talking about this. The other thing is TDM is going to require some commitment of funds in the first few years to get it off the ground. If we don't get that funds, then the plan doesn't work. Similarly, I think Bruce and Rachel put in the study for the Bat Lane corridor. And if that's near and dear to the heart and it's of high priority, we need to make sure people understand that some commitment, usually revenue and funds, is allocated to that. So we do that study and we can start the coordination with the other agencies and make it come and make it happen. So I like to give that perspective because it's not that staff doesn't want to do things or doesn't see that. It's also that there has to be that commitment from the larger body as well that they will actually implement these things.
And I want to stress that too. I think that's a very good point, Steve. That and Commissioner Kurd, you really hit the nail on the head. We have to do these other things in order for this to be successful. The plan is really hinging upon doing TDM, doing reduced parking standards, putting some effort and some resources into making sure the TDM program is successful, and doing some of these other things that we've talked about. So it's really critical that we continue to really push those things. We have a briefing next Tuesday night. Bruce and Rachel will be briefing the council, going to bring them up to speed on a lot of the things we've talked to the commission about so far. And transportation is going to be a big part of that. And we will be stressing with them that there are some costs involved in this, even to do a TDM program. So I think that's, as Steve said, we're really trying to make this happen as well. We have to look at it in the bigger context of things. One other quick thing I wanted to mention is we are coming up on 8:45. I don't know how much. I just want to do a time check. I don't know how much more presentation or discussion that we're looking for.
That was the last topic.
That's it. Oh.
Okay. So we might be able to get it done in the next 15 minutes. I don't want to cut off commission discussion though.
Well, I've heard a lot of support from the commissioners for transit. The struggle and bat lanes. The struggle is how and when to incorporate it in the plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we've heard some direction from the commission. I think that consistent with what you've said in the past is you really want to emphasize transit and transit service and improve transit service to this area. So that'll be reflected in the plan. That'll be reflected in the strategies. And I think from a staff standpoint, we're going to look at, what are the practical implications of that, and we may recommend something slightly different in terms of the bat lanes. We're not taking it out of the plan, but I think we may, and the commission's recommendation may be very strong in that regard, and that's fine. Just to let you know, this may be an area where the staff differs just a little bit from what the commission's recommendation might be. But obviously we carry both of those forward to the council, and we explain what the commission's recommendation is and why, and the strength of that recommendation, and why the staff would be recommending something slightly different. Again, not taking it out of the plan, just looking at it in terms of probably more of the priorities. Mm-hmm. I did want to give one example too. Steve mentioned something about commute trip reduction and TDM and how commuting has really changed. I received a copy of an email that was sent out the other day from King County Department of Natural Resources and Parks. This came from the director of that department, and it was a message to the staff. 800 of their employees are going to be permanently teleworking. They are vacating a large portion of one of the downtown buildings that department occupies, and setting up collaboration hubs around the county where the different folks will be working and getting together in person when they need to do that, when they're able to do that. But if you think about one agency in one government, one department, I should say, in one government agency, suddenly taking 800 trips, 800 cars off the road. They probably weren't all driving. I'm sure many of them were using transit, but that has implications as well. This is just, I think, an indication of some of the changes that we may see in commuting patterns. So we're trying to keep that in mind as well. We don't know what's going to happen, but we are going to see some changes.
So did I see Commissioner Vliet?
Thank you. Thank you for touching on that, Michael. Very good point. I was going to bring that up earlier with regards to patterns changing over time because of the crisis, the pandemic. Just a real, I know we're getting close to the end. So, but one thing I wanted to mention with regards to transportation and with regard, something we're talking about now with regards to parking and sustainability goals. One thing I've, as a electric car owner, EV car owner myself, there's very few places to charge your car. So I don't know what the possibilities would be for the city to be able to have a public-private partnership. I mean, Canyon Park's gonna, I mean, that just seems like an obvious choice for a lot of charging capability. So I just wanted to, I didn't necessarily want to have a discussion on it, but I did want to kind of point that out as there are very few places to charge your car in the city of Bothell. So thank you.
Oh, we're going dark. Lost our lights again. But I can see you. Any other commissioner comments or questions? We do have this coming up for 2 more meetings, so you can ponder these issues and come back too. Not seeing any other comments from commissioners. Bruce, you want to walk us through next steps and where we go from here?
Certainly, thank you. The next step is next week we'll have a public hearing. I expect we'll have quite a few more people, members of the public, who will participate either virtually or via email. And then we are hopeful that we will probably have another hearing on August the 5th. And from that standpoint, we believe we probably be in a position where we may be able to take forward a recommendation from the commission. We'll just have to play it by ear. One of the things you're going to get in your packet this week will be the Subarea plan, as well as an addendum to the draft environmental impact statement that was issued. The addendum just basically adds some more background information on buildable lands, capacity, and transportation. So it'll be a good read for you folks if you are so inclined to do it. So that's our next steps. It'll be pretty exciting here in the next couple of weeks as we go through some of these processes and come up with some of these ideas for you guys to explore. So if there's anything else the commission would like us to provide that has been not, maybe somebody didn't had a chance to identify that earlier, please let us know and we'll see if we can incorporate that into your packets.
And if I can just piggyback on what Bruce said, the next couple of weeks, what we're going to be asking for from the commission is your feedback on some specific components of the plan and then the draft code as we bring that to you as well. So you'll notice in the Subarea plan a lot of information that you've already seen. So we've been trying to give you the information, the background, the analysis that's been done leading to this point. And then we've talked about the vision in the past. So now we have policies, we have goals that are more specific, and we're looking for some direction from the commission on making sure that we've captured all of the policies, the sentiment, the direction that you want to see in the plan. So I would ask that you focus on those. Read through the plan as much as you can. It's a lengthy, robust document, but it's got a lot of good stuff in there. But again, I think a lot of that you've seen in one form or another. So there shouldn't be that much new in terms of the information that's in there. This is really getting now more down to affirming the direction that we've been hearing from you, making sure that we've incorporated that into the plan in a way that makes sense to you, that conveys what you want your recommendation to be going forward to the city council. And the other piece of that is really just lost my train of thought. So, but looking forward to the implementation, the code, and at this point, we hope to bring that to you by August 5th. That's going to be a little bit of a push. So we will see how that works out. We may have to extend the public hearing even into September. I hope not, but we'll take as long as we need to get through this with the commission so that you're comfortable with your recommendation to the city council. So, and I note the other thing was, just to reiterate what Bruce said, if there's other information that you need to help you make that recommendation, that's the other thing that we need to hear from you in the next couple of weeks. Next week in particular, because then that gives us time to bring it back for August 5th, if we're able to get to a recommendation at that point. So just want to emphasize that aspect of what we're looking for. Any questions about that? I tend to over-explain and lose people in the process, so I want to make sure I didn't do that.
So unless there are any other questions or comments on this, recognizing we will have other opportunities, I would propose we close this item and move along. Hearing no objections, I'll ask if there's any old business we need to address. I'm seeing no. Reports from staff.
A couple of quick items. So just to let you know, the governor did extend the Open Public Meetings Act exemption or waiver. So didn't know that in time for this evening. We had one in-person testimony, which worked out fine. But in the future, for the next one at least, that will we'll still be doing everything remotely, including public comment. For August 5th, unless it gets extended again, we may be back to what we were trying to do tonight. It's honestly, it's a
Work in progress.
It's a daily challenge just to find out what the latest is, but we will. That's our challenge. We'll keep up with that. Just so you know, we are working on that. We want to make sure that people have an opportunity to comment. We are meeting next week also with the Canyon Park Business Center Owners Association. They've been one of the major stakeholders, obviously, in this area. They've been very involved throughout. They've provided written comment, so we're checking in with them, and we'll have that information to provide to you as you discuss and deliberate and develop your recommendation to the council. And then I did mention next week we've got a briefing with council on the 14th. The next night is your continuation of this public hearing, which I'm sad to say will also be Bruce's last working day with the city. Then he's taking 2 weeks of vacation, and then he's taking many years of vacation after that for retirement.
We'll have to have a virtual toast.
Yes. So I'm sure we'll have some things to say to give Bruce the send off next week. But just wanted to let you know that that will be his last meeting. He's going out in style.
Yeah, with bags under my eyes.
All right. Keeping in mind we have about 2 minutes left. Any reports from members? Being none and being there no further business, do I have a motion to adjourn? Commissioner Alderks.
I motion to adjourn this meeting.
And second, Commissioner Vliet.
Second that motion.
So we have moved and second to adjourn. All in favor? So the Bothell Planning Commission July 8th meeting is adjourned at 8:59. Thank you all and see you next week.
Good timing. Thank you.
Very much.